Dr. Martingale had dealt with bureaucratic nightmares before, but this was the first time it had ever come in the form of an alien surgeon calmly refusing to save a dying patient. The Solarain Medical Institute was hailed as the most advanced surgical center in the known galaxy. It was a place where entire limbs could be regrown, neural pathways could be reconstructed, and diseases thought incurable on Earth were treated with clinical efficiency. So when Ambassador Holt's shuttle collided with a malfunctioning cargo drone above Vexor Station, sending her crashing into a docking bay with severe internal injuries, Martin had assumed she was in the best possible hands. He had been wrong. "You're telling me," Martin said, rubbing his temples as he struggled to keep his voice level, "that you have the technology, the knowledge, and the equipment to save her, but you just won't do it." Soral, the lead Solarain surgeon, remained unfazed. His elongated, shimmering form stood rigid, his six-fingered hands clasped in front of him. "Dr. Gale, our surgical methodologies require cellular adaptability. Human physiology is incompatible with our regenerative techniques." Martin let out a sharp breath. "You mean our bodies don't automatically heal like yours do?" Soral nodded, his three large eyes blinking in slow succession. "Correct. Solarain anatomy is designed for seamless regeneration. Our surgical procedures work in tandem with that process. To operate on a human, or any species with static cellular structures, is not only untested but dangerous. It violates our ethical standards." Martin stared at him. "Violates your— are you hearing yourself? She's going to die." Soral did not waver. "We do not perform surgery where the natural corrective mechanisms of the body cannot ensure a positive outcome." "Natural corrective," Martin almost laughed. "Your ethics don't account for the fact that some species need external intervention? That we don't regenerate organs on command?" "That is precisely why we do not operate," said Arol, another Solarain surgeon, stepping forward. She was smaller than Soral, with a more translucent hue to her skin, but her expression was just as resolute. "To interfere in a biological system that lacks regenerative certainty is to risk irreversible damage. Without the body's ability to correct our work, a single error could mean catastrophic failure." Martin clenched his fists. "She's already experiencing catastrophic failure." Silence filled the surgical bay. The machines around them hummed softly, displaying Holt's steadily declining vitals. If she didn't receive immediate intervention, she wouldn't make it through the next hour. Martin exhaled through gritted teeth. "Fine, if you won't do it, I will." Arol's translucent skin rippled with what Martin could only assume was disbelief. "You lack the expertise." Martin marched past them toward the surgical table. "Then you'd better guide me." Soral placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm but not forceful. "Dr. Gale, if you proceed with this, you will do so without our assistance. No Solarain physician will take responsibility for an operation that our ethics deem unacceptable." Martin turned to face him. "I'm not asking for responsibility. I'm asking for help." Soral's eyes flickered toward Holt, then back to Martin. "We will not interfere." Martin swallowed the lump of frustration in his throat. There was no time for arguments. Holt needed him. Without another word, he turned back to the table and activated the surgical interface. The Solarain operating room was unlike anything Martin had ever worked in. It wasn't sterile in the traditional human sense. There were no metal trays, no scalpels, no overhead lamps. Instead, the room itself functioned as the surgical instrument. Holographic displays projected multi-layered anatomical scans in midair, while microscopic drones hovered at the ready, awaiting commands. Martin had spent months studying Solarain medical technology, but theory was a poor substitute for real practice. He was about to perform a high-risk operation on an alien surgical system that wasn't even designed for human bodies. He adjusted the controls, bringing up a detailed visualization of Holt's injuries. The scan displayed multiple lacerations to her liver, severe internal bleeding, and a punctured lung. Martin took a steadying breath. "All right, one step at a time." He activated the first tool, a slender instrument that emitted a beam of focused energy, designed to cauterize wounds with microscopic precision. He moved it toward the damaged liver tissue, carefully sealing the hemorrhaging vessels. The technology was more efficient than anything on Earth, but its sensitivity meant one wrong move could cause irreparable damage. His hands were steady, but sweat beaded at his temples. The next step was stabilizing her lung. He navigated the interface, selecting a Cellerane biogel used for tissue reconstruction. Normally, the gel worked in harmony with the Cellerane regenerative process, but he had no idea how it would react to human biology. He had to modify the application, using only enough to reinforce the lung without triggering adverse effects. As he worked, he became hyper-aware of the presence behind him. Though the Celleranase had refused to participate, a role had not left the room. "You're making adjustments," she noted, her voice tinged with curiosity. Martin didn't look up. "Your methods assume the body will fix mistakes. Ours don't. I don't have the luxury of letting your tools work the way they were designed." Silence. Then, a hesitant step forward. "You are using the tissue stabilizer at a lower frequency," Aurole observed. "Yes," Martin said, keeping his focus on the lung. "Too much stimulation would cause cellular rejection. I need just enough to encourage adhesion without forcing regeneration." Another pause. Then, to his shock, Aurole reached forward and adjusted a setting on the interface. "Try this," she said. Martin glanced at her. "I thought you weren't allowed to interfere." Aurole's skin shimmered in a conflicted hue. "I am not operating. I am observing." Martin smirked. "Observing, huh?" He returned to work. Aurole's vitals remained unstable, but they were no longer worsening. The hardest part was yet to come, removing the shrapnel from her abdomen. He activated the precision drones, guiding them through the incisions with painstaking care. For the first time, Aurole's voice carried something other than cold logic. "Your adaptability is remarkable." Martin didn't respond. He was too focused on navigating the final piece of shrapnel away from a major artery. Time blurred as he worked, each second stretching into eternity. Finally, as the last fragment was extracted and the final sutures were secured, Holt's vitals stabilized. Martin exhaled deeply, his arms trembling from exhaustion. He turned to Aurole, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. "She's going to make it," he said. Aurole regarded him for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "Your methods are reckless. They defy everything we consider acceptable. And yet," she looked at Holt, "you succeeded." Martin wiped his forehead, his body finally registering its exhaustion. "Sometimes you have to take the risk." The door hissed open. Soral entered, his gaze sweeping over the room. He looked from Martin to Holt, then to Aurole. "She will recover?" he asked. Martin nodded. Soral was silent. Then he turned to Aurole. "You assisted him." Aurole's translucent skin flickered in uncertainty. "I observed." Soral's eyes lingered on her before he shifted his attention back to Martin. "You have forced us to reconsider what we once thought impossible," Soral admitted, "but we are not yet convinced." Martin smirked, too tired to argue. "Then, let me convince you." Soral studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once. "We shall see." As he left the room, Martin allowed himself a small, weary smile. He wasn't done yet. Martin barely had time to recover from the adrenaline of the operation before the backlash began. Cellerane medical authorities convened a formal review within hours, summoning him to an official hearing deep within the medical institute. The hearing chamber was a stark contrast to the sterile precision of the surgical bay. It was a vast, dimly lit hall lined with floating crystalline structures that pulsed in rhythm with the Cellerane's biosignatures. The entire chamber felt alive, as if the walls themselves were listening. Martin sat stiffly in the center, feeling like a defendant on trial. Across from him stood the Institute's senior board, 5 high-ranking Cellerane physicians, their iridescent skin shifting in shades of cool blues and deep purples, a sign of intense deliberation. Soral stood among them, his expression unreadable. "The operation was unauthorized," said a Cellerane named Velnir, his voice resonating through the chamber. "You ignored protocol and introduced unverified procedures into a controlled medical environment." Martin leaned forward. She was dying. What was I supposed to do? Stand there and let her bleed out? Velnir's skin flickered darkly. Intervening in cases outside our accepted surgical parameters is prohibited for a reason. Your species lacks the regenerative compatibility necessary for corrective procedures. Martin had heard enough of that excuse. He gestured toward Sorrel. You saw the results. Ambassador Holt is alive. She's stable. That should tell you something. Sorrel hesitated before responding. It tells us that human methods, while crude, can be effective, but they are not sustainable within our medical framework. Martin scoffed. Sustainable? What does that even mean? Velnier gestured, and a holographic projection appeared between them. It showed a time-lapse simulation of Holt's recovery, but the model predicted failure. The projection indicated that without regenerative reinforcement, her internal scarring could lead to long-term complications. The human body, Velnier continued, does not respond predictably to our treatments. In Solarain medicine, we do not simply repair, we restore. Your method provides no guarantee of restoration. Martin crossed his arms. You're saying because I can't guarantee perfection, you'd rather guarantee failure. The chamber fell silent. Some of the Solarains exchanged glances, their skin shifting in undecipherable tones. Then, unexpectedly, Aurole spoke. Dr. Gale adapted. All eyes turned to her. He modified every step of the procedure to account for human biology, she continued. He recognized the limitations and adjusted in real time. That is not crude, that is innovation. Martin blinked. That was the closest thing to a compliment he'd received since arriving on this planet. Velnier regarded Aurole for a long moment before turning back to Martin. Even if we accept that your approach worked, it does not alter the fact that it was reckless. Martin exhaled sharply. You think I don't know that? You think I wanted to be the one performing experimental surgery with no backup? Your people left me no choice. Sorrel's three eyes narrowed slightly. We left you no choice because your methods rely too heavily on improvisation. Our medical philosophy does not permit uncertainty. Martin leaned forward. Then maybe your philosophy needs to change. A murmur rippled through the board. The very suggestion was unheard of. Solarains prided themselves on their medical perfectionism. To alter their ethical code was unthinkable. Velnier's skin darkened further. This hearing is concluded. We will review the matter and determine whether any further action will be taken. Martin stood, shaking his head. You're missing the point. This isn't about one patient. If humans or any non-regenerative species are ever going to be treated here, you need to rethink your entire approach. Sorrel met his gaze. That remains to be seen. With that, the hearing was over. Martin returned to the medical bay, exhausted but restless. Holt was still unconscious but stable. The machines monitoring her vitals emitted a rhythmic pulse, a steady beat that reassured him. He had saved her. That should have been enough. But it wasn't. The Solaraines weren't just refusing to accept his actions, they were refusing to acknowledge the possibility that surgery could exist without biological regeneration as a safety net. Their entire medical system was built on the assumption that mistakes were self-correcting. To them, human medicine wasn't just dangerous. It was fundamentally incompatible with their understanding of healing. Which meant that if another human or any other species without regenerative biology ever needed treatment here, they'd be left to die. Martin ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. He needed a way to prove that surgery could work without the Solarain's built-in fail-safes. The problem was, he couldn't do it alone. As if on cue, the door slid open, and Aurole stepped inside. Martin glanced at her. Here to tell me how reckless I am again. Aurole's translucent skin shimmered uncertainly. Not reckless. Different. He snorted. That's a new one. She hesitated, then gestured toward Holt. Her vitals are improving. Your methods, while unconventional, were effective. Martin folded his arms. Are you admitting I was right? Aurole's skin flickered in a way Martin couldn't decipher. You were not entirely wrong. He sighed. Close enough. Aurole took a step closer. The Institute will not change its stance easily. Solarain medicine is not built on adaptation. It is built on certainty. Martin studied her. But you're not sure that's the right way anymore, are you? Aurole hesitated. I saw you watching during the surgery, he continued. You weren't just observing, you were learning. Her skin shimmered again. You made decisions in real time, adjusted for variables. It was unexpected. Martin nodded. That's what we do. We adapt. We take risks because sometimes there's no other choice. Aurole was silent for a long moment. Then she said something Martin hadn't expected. I want to understand. Martin raised an eyebrow. Understand what? Aurole looked at Holt, then back at him. Your methods, your reasoning. If I am to challenge our philosophy, I must first understand yours. Martin studied her. He hadn't expected an ally, let alone from someone as entrenched in Silurian medical doctrine as Aurole. He extended a hand. Then let's get started. Aurole hesitated before shaking it. A small victory. But the real battle was just beginning. Martin was back in the Silurian Medical Institute, but this time he wasn't alone. Aurole stood beside him, her iridescent skin shifting subtly in the sterile light of the surgical suite. A few feet away, a holographic model of an injured humanoid rotated in midair, a simulation of a human patient with internal bleeding and organ damage. It wasn't Ambassador Holt, but a theoretical case designed to test Martin's methods. Aurole gestured toward the display. The Institute has authorized an experimental evaluation of your surgical techniques. No actual patients will be involved. If you fail to demonstrate a sustainable approach, human surgeries will remain prohibited. Martin crossed his arms. Let me guess. They're hoping I fail so they never have to deal with this again. Aurole's translucent skin flickered in what Martin had come to recognize as hesitation. There are many who believe your methods are inherently flawed. The belief that biological correction is necessary is deeply ingrained in our medical philosophy. Martin sighed. Yeah, I got that he glanced at the simulation. So what's the test? Aurole manipulated the interface, and the holographic patient's injuries deepened, showing a punctured lung and severe arterial damage. You must stabilize this patient using only techniques that do not rely on regenerative compatibility. The parameters are set for human physiology, and the system will analyze your success rate based on survival probability and long-term viability. Martin exhaled sharply. All right, let's do this. The simulation began. The holographic patient's vitals fluctuated in real time, mimicking the rapid decline of a critical injury. Martin immediately moved into action, selecting tools from the Silurian surgical interface and modifying their output to suit human biology. Step 1, stop the bleeding. He activated a cauterization tool, but unlike Silurian surgeons who relied on biological regeneration to seal microtears, Martin had to use controlled bursts of energy to ensure the wound wouldn't reopen. He adjusted the settings manually, overriding the automated protocols that assumed tissue repair would begin on its own. Step 2, stabilize the lung. Aurole watched closely as he navigated the interface, selecting a biopolymer sealant that had never been tested on humans. Martin had studied its properties after Holt's surgery, determining that in low doses, it could act as a synthetic barrier while the body healed naturally. He applied it carefully, using minimal amounts to reinforce the damaged tissue without overwhelming the system. Step 3, prevent further complications. The Silurian system flagged a potential issue without regenerative reinforcement. Scarring in the artery could lead to long-term instability. Martin adjusted his approach again, using microsutures instead of the Silurians' typical self-correcting vascular bonding. Every move he made was another argument against their rigid philosophy. Every adjustment proved that surgery didn't need a built-in safety net to be viable. Minutes stretched into an hour. Finally, the simulation ended. The holographic patient stabilized. The system analyzed the data, calculating survival probability. A number appeared in the air: 84% projected success rate. Aurole stared at it. This is unexpected. Martin wiped his brow. Better than some real-world outcomes I've had back on Earth. Aurole's skin shimmered in contemplation. The projected long-term viability is lower than our standard threshold. However, it is not an outright failure. Martin turned to her. That's the point. Medicine isn't about guarantees. It's about giving patients a chance. Aurole remained silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, she said, "I will present these findings to the Institute." Martin frowned. "You think they'll listen?" Aurole's gaze flickered to the simulation. "They will have to." 2 days passed before Martin was summoned back to the Institute's hearing chamber. The same high-ranking Solarain physicians stood before him, their expressions unreadable. Sorrel was among them, his skin an impassive shade of deep violet. Velnir addressed him first. "We have reviewed the results of your simulated procedure." Martin straightened. "And?" Velnir's gaze was calculating. "The outcome was not as definitive as we had hoped. Your methods lack certainty. However," he hesitated, exchanging a glance with Sorrel. Sorrel stepped forward. "Your work has demonstrated adaptability. It is difficult to dismiss entirely." Martin's pulse quickened. Was that progress? Aurole spoke next. "The Institute has agreed to a conditional allowance. Human surgical techniques may be studied further under supervised trials. If future cases demonstrate sustainable success, the restriction on non-regenerative surgeries may be reconsidered." Martin let out a slow breath. "You're saying you'll actually let us operate?" Velnir's expression remained neutral. "Under strict oversight. This is not a full acceptance of your methods, but a measured evaluation." Martin glanced at Aurole, who met his gaze with something resembling approval. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start. Sorrel studied Martin for a moment longer. "Your approach defies our conventions, but perhaps there is merit in re-examining them." Martin smirked. "That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me." Sorrel's 3 eyes blinked in slow succession. "Do not grow accustomed to it." Martin chuckled. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time it felt like the Solarians were willing to listen. And that was more than he could have asked for. Martin didn't have to wait long for the first real test of the Solarain Medical Institute's newfound willingness to embrace human surgical methods. It came unexpectedly just 2 weeks after the hearing, when a distress call from a deep space research vessel sent the entire facility into an urgent scramble. The Tandis, a multi-species scientific ship, had suffered a catastrophic reactor malfunction, causing widespread injuries among its crew. Several casualties were already confirmed, but one patient in particular caught Martin's attention. He was a human. Dr. Elias Warner, a xenobiologist from Earth, had been aboard as part of an interspecies medical exchange. He had suffered severe abdominal trauma, including extensive internal bleeding and organ damage injuries eerily similar to what Ambassador Holt had endured. But this time, Martin wasn't the only one considering surgery. In the emergency ward, Solarain physicians gathered around Warner's biobed, their holographic interfaces flashing urgent warnings. Martin pushed his way through the group, his heart pounding. "What's his status?" Sorrel turned toward him, his 3 eyes scanning the human doctor. "Severe hemorrhaging. Cellular integrity is compromised." Martin nodded. "Then we need to operate. Now." Sorrel's gaze lingered on Warner, then shifted to Aurole, who stood beside Martin. "Your simulations suggested a probability of success," Sorrel said carefully. "But this is not a simulation." Martin could barely contain his frustration. "That's how medicine works, Sorrel. It's not about certainty. It's about action." Aurole's translucent skin shimmered with something close to resolve. "The Institute authorized experimental trials. This qualifies." For a long moment, Sorrel said nothing. Then, finally, he stepped aside. "Proceed." Martin didn't hesitate. The operating room was a controlled storm of motion. Martin worked fast, guiding the Solarain surgical drones with a precision that was both human and improvised. Unlike their usual methods where every movement was dictated by pre-calculated certainty, Martin adjusted in real time, responding to Warner's shifting vitals as he went. Sorrel and Aurole watched closely, but this time they weren't just observing. When Martin reached a particularly delicate point, removing a shard of debris that had lodged itself dangerously close to a major artery, Aurole did something unthinkable. She stepped in. I can stabilize the vascular region using controlled compression, she said, activating a Solarain surgical field, but I will need to modify the standard output to accommodate non-regenerative tissue. Martin gave her a quick nod. Do it. Together, they worked. Martin handled the manual repairs while Aurole adapted Solarain technology in ways her species had never attempted. Sorrel monitored Warner's vitals, adjusting neural stabilizers as needed. The operation lasted nearly 3 hours, and by the end, Warner's condition had gone from critical to stable. As the last suture was placed, a strange silence filled the room. Sorrel exhaled, a slow, measured release. He will recover. Martin leaned against the surgical table, exhausted but triumphant. Told you. Aurole glanced at the monitors, then at Martin. This was not just adaptation, it was collaboration. Martin gave her a tired smile. Guess that means you're officially a surgeon now. Aurole's skin shimmered faintly, and though he wasn't sure, Martin liked to think it was amusement. The aftermath of the surgery sent ripples through the Solarain medical community. For the first time in their history, Solarain physicians had successfully operated on a patient without relying on biological regeneration. The Institute had no choice but to formally acknowledge the success. A month later, a new policy was introduced, one that allowed for the study and implementation of surgical techniques for non-regenerative species. It was cautious, heavily regulated, and still met with resistance from traditionalists, but it was a start. Martin stood outside the medical institute, looking up at the towering crystalline structures. He had come here expecting resistance. He had found it in abundance. But he had also found something else change. Aurole approached him, her posture more relaxed than he had ever seen. You are leaving soon. Martin nodded. Heading back to Earth next week. But something tells me I'll be back. Aurole studied him. The Institute is changing. Slowly. Martin smirked. Change always starts slow. She hesitated before speaking again. When you first arrived, I believed your methods were reckless. That belief has evolved. Martin chuckled. I'll take that as a compliment. Aurole's skin flickered. You should. As they stood there, the weight of what they had accomplished settled between them. It wasn't a complete victory, and the road ahead would be difficult. But the first step had been taken. And that, Martin knew, was how every revolution began.